1 denarius. That was the value of an entire day of manual labor under the Palestinian sun. With that single coin, a worker needed to feed his family, pay taxes to Rome, contribute to the temple, and still survive. Most couldn't manage it, and it is precisely in this scenario of suffocating economic pressure that Jesus' parables about money take on a meaning most people have never noticed. To understand the world where Jesus was born, lived, and taught, you need to understand one thing above all else. Money was the real language of the first century. Not Latin, not Greek, not Aramaic. Money. Every coin that changed hands in first century Palestine carried a political, religious, and social message. The Roman denarius bore the face of Tiberius Caesar with an inscription declaring him son of the divine Augustus. Just by holding that coin, a devout Jew already faced a dilemma because the Torah prohibited carved images, and there he was, with the face of a pagan emperor who proclaimed himself divine, resting in the palm of his hand. Every commercial transaction was, at the same time, an economic act and a small ideological surrender. The monetary system of first-century Palestine was a calculated chaos. Roman, Greek, Syrian, and local coins circulated simultaneously. The Roman silver denarius was equivalent to approximately 3.8 grams of silver and represented the standard currency for larger transactions and payment of imperial taxes. Below, it came the assariai, bronze coins worth 1/16 of a denarius, and further below the lepta, the smallest coins in circulation made of copper, practically worthless individually. It was exactly 2 lepta that a widow deposited in the temple's treasury chest, in a scene the Gospels recorded. 2 lepta were equivalent to 1 Roman quadrans, something around 1/64 of a denarius. For comparison, it was as if someone today dropped pennies into an offering plate while everyone around them tossed bills. Now put into perspective what it meant to live on 1 denarius a day. A common worker in Galilee, whether a stonemason, farmer, or fisherman, received on average 1 denarius per workday, which stretched from sunrise to sunset, somewhere between 10 and 12 hours of continuous physical effort. With that single denarius, he needed to cover food for a family of 5 to 7 people, buy fuel for cooking, replace work tools, pay accumulated debts, and still set aside a portion for taxes. A whole loaf of bread cost between 1 and 2 assariai. 1 liter of olive oil, an essential item in the Mediterranean diet, could cost up to half a denarius. Salted fish, the most accessible protein in Galilee, cost between 2 and 4 assariai per portion. Meat was an absolute luxury. Most of the population ate meat only at religious festivals, when animals were sacrificed at the temple and part of the offering was returned to the worshipper. And then came the taxes. Rome had turned taxation into a science. The system was so sophisticated that modern historians compare it to the fiscal structures of 19th century states. There were at least 7 distinct categories of taxes that a common inhabitant of Judea or Galilee paid regularly. The tributum soli was the tax on land. Between 20 and 25% of all agricultural production went directly into Rome's coffers. The tributum capitis was the per capita tax, levied on every adult between 14 and 65 years of age. Beyond these, there were taxes on sales, on the transport of goods, on the use of roads, on the use of ports, and even on salt. When you add it all up, it is estimated that between 35 and 40% of a common worker's income was consumed by Roman taxes. But Rome was not the only one collecting. The Jerusalem temple operated its own taxation system parallel to the Roman one. Every Jewish man above 20 years of age was required to pay the annual temple tax, half a shekel, equivalent to 2 denarii. It seems little, but it represents 2 full days of work. In addition, the Torah prescribed the tithe, 10% of all agricultural and livestock production. In practice, there were multiple tithes, The first tithe went to the Levites. The second tithe was used by the worshipper himself in Jerusalem during the festivals, and every 3 years there was a third tithe designated for the poor. When you combine Roman taxation with religious taxation, a worker in Galilee could lose between 50 and 70% of everything he produced. Almost nothing was left. And it is precisely here that the figure of the tax collectors takes on contours that the Gospels capture with surgical precision. Tax collectors were not public servants in the modern sense. They were outsourced tax collectors. Rome auctioned off the right to collect taxes in each region, and the tax collector who won the auction paid the estimated value of the tributes in advance. From that point on, everything he managed to collect above that amount was his own profit. The system was an institutionalized invitation to corruption. A tax collector could, and almost always did, charge 2, 3, or even 4 times the actual amount of the tax. There was no efficient oversight, the population had no one to turn to, and the tax collector relied on the backing of Roman troops to ensure collection. When the Gospels record that Jesus sat at the table with tax collectors, the scandal was not merely religious, it was economic and social. Those men were seen as traitors who enriched themselves at the expense of the suffering of their own people. Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector of Jericho mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, was described as extremely wealthy. Jericho sat on a strategic commercial route between Jerusalem and the regions beyond the Jordan. Every product that passed through there was taxed. Zacchaeus' fortune was built literally on the backs of merchants and peasants who had no alternative but to pay. But commerce in first-century Palestine was not limited to taxes and suffering. There was a real, vibrant economy, surprisingly connected to the rest of the Mediterranean world. Galilee, where Jesus spent most of his life, was a fertile agricultural region that exported olive oil, wine, grain, and salted fish. The Sea of Galilee, the Lake of Gennesaret, sustained a significant fishing industry. Historians estimate that between 200 and 300 boats operated simultaneously on that lake of just 166 square kilometers. Fishing was organized into family cooperatives. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were not solitary fishermen. The Gospel of Mark records that they had employees. This indicates a business of reasonable scale. The fish court followed a well-defined economic circuit. Part was sold fresh in the local markets of Capernaum, Bethsaida, and Tiberias. Another part was salted and dried in processing facilities around the lake. The city of Magdala, from where Mary Magdalene came, was known precisely for its salted fish industry. The Greek name of the city, Tarichaea, literally means place of salting. This processed fish was exported to Jerusalem, to the Decapolis, and even to more distant markets in the eastern Mediterranean. A single salting operation in Magdala could process hundreds of kilograms of fish per week. Olive oil was another fundamental economic pillar. Galilee and Judea produced olive oil of recognized quality throughout the Roman Empire. Archaeological excavations have revealed olive presses in virtually every village in the region. The process was intensive. About 5 kilograms of olives produced only 1 liter of oil. An average family maintained between 50 and 100 olive trees, and each tree produced between 30 and 50 kilograms of olives per harvest. Olive oil served not only as food, but as fuel for lamps, as the base for medicines, as a hygiene product, and as a central element in the religious rituals of the temple. Jerusalem consumed enormous quantities of olive oil to keep the temple's lampstand permanently lit. And here arises a mechanism that few people notice. The Jerusalem temple was not merely a religious center, it was the largest economic engine in the entire region. It functioned as a bank, currency exchange, commodities market, and mass employer, all at the same time. The historian Flavius Josephus recorded that approximately 18,000 workers were involved in the construction projects expanding the temple during Herod's period. When the work was completed around the year 64, the resulting unemployment was so severe that the temple authorities created a public works program to relocate the workers, paving Jerusalem streets with white stone to prevent a social crisis. The temple received tributes and offerings from Jews scattered throughout the empire. It is estimated that the Jewish diaspora in the first century numbered between 4 and 5 million people, far more than the population of Judea itself, which hovered around 1 million. Each of these dispersed Jews sent their annual half-shekel to Jerusalem. It is calculated that the temple collected somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million denarii per year from this tax alone. Adding voluntary offerings, tithes, payments for sacrifices, and income from properties, the temple's annual revenue rivaled that of small kingdoms. The temple treasury was so vast that Crassus, the Roman general, plundered from it the equivalent of more than 2,000 talents of gold and silver in the year 54 before Christ, a fortune that financed entire military campaigns. The money changers Jesus confronted in the temple courtyard were not marginal figures. They operated an essential service within that system. Roman coins bearing the image of the emperor were considered impure for religious offerings. Every pilgrim who arrived in Jerusalem needed to exchange their money for Tyrian coins. Tyrian shekels were accepted by the temple because of their high silver content, despite, ironically, also bearing the image of a pagan deity, the god Melkart. The money changers charged a fee of 4 to 8% per transaction during the 3 great annual festivals, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. When hundreds of thousands of pilgrims converged on Jerusalem, the volume of exchange was astronomical. The court of the Gentiles was transformed into an open-air financial market. Alongside the money changers operated the sellers of animals for sacrifice. The Torah required that animals offered be without defect. Temple inspectors examined the animals brought by pilgrims and, with suspicious frequency, rejected them, forcing the purchase of approved animals sold right there at inflated prices. A pair of doves, the cheapest offering permitted for the poorest, could cost up to 25 times more inside the temple than in the outside market. When Jesus overturned the tables and said they had turned the house of prayer into a den of thieves, the accusation was literal. That system crushed precisely the most vulnerable: the widows, the poor, those who had already traveled for days and could not return without fulfilling their religious obligation. The structure of economic classes in first-century Palestine was rigidly stratified. At the top were the large landowners, the priestly aristocracy of Jerusalem and the Herodian families, who controlled vast agricultural properties worked by tenants and day laborers. Just below came the mid-level merchants, skilled craftsmen, and small rural landowners. Then the enormous base of day laborers, independent fishermen, shepherds, and common artisans. And at the bottom, those who had absolutely nothing: widows without family, orphans, lepers, the disabled, and the indebted who had lost their land. The loss of land was an open social wound. The system of progressive indebtedness functioned as a nearly inescapable trap. A small farmer who had a bad harvest, from drought, plague, or simply excessive taxes, resorted to loans. Interest rates, despite the biblical prohibition on usury between Jews, could reach 25 or even 50% per year when disguised in contractual arrangements. If he could not pay, he lost his land. Without land, he became a day laborer. As a day laborer, he was at the mercy of the daily labor market, and in the Gospels, Jesus describes exactly this scene. Workers waiting in the square since before dawn, hoping someone would hire them before the day ended with no income at all. The parable of the workers in the vineyard in Matthew chapter 20 was not fiction. It was the faithful portrait of everyday despair. The construction industry was another sector that moved fortunes and exploited bodies. Herod the Great was one of the greatest builders of antiquity. Besides the monumental expansion of the Jerusalem temple, he built Caesarea Maritima, an entire port city built from scratch, with an artificial harbor, theater, amphitheater, hippodrome, sewage system, and aqueduct. The harbor at Caesarea used a Roman hydraulic concrete technology that hardened underwater. Blocks up to 15 meters long were submerged to create the breakwaters. The labor for these constructions came primarily from forced labor and desperate day workers. Herod also built the fortress of Masada atop a plateau in the Judean desert, palaces in Jericho, the Antonia fortress in Jerusalem, and the city of Sebast in Samaria. Each project consumed thousands of workers for years. The human cost of these works was never recorded in official documents, only the dried sweat in the stones. The international trade that crossed Palestine added another layer of economic complexity. The region sat at the intersection of two of the most important trade routes of the ancient world. The Via Maris connected Egypt to Mesopotamia, passing through the coastal plain and the valley of Jezreel. The King's Highway ran through Transjordan, linking the Gulf of Aqaba to Damascus. Spices from Arabia, silk from China, incense from Yemen, papyrus from Egypt, ceramics from Italy, and metals from Asia Minor traveled these routes. Every caravan that crossed the territory meant transit taxes, and whoever controlled the crossing points controlled wealth. Capernaum, the city Jesus used as his base of operations in Galilee, sat at precisely one of these commercial crossroads. The presence of a customs post there, where Matthew worked as a tax collector before being called, was no coincidence. It was pure economic geography. The city sat on the border between the territories of Herod Antipas and his brother Philip, which meant that goods crossing from one territory to the other were taxed right there. Matthew had access to one of the most consistent money taps in all of Galilee. The textile industry was another relevant sector. Wool, linen, and even silk moved local and regional markets. Linen cultivated in Galilee was transformed into fabric by specialized craftsmen. Purple, the most expensive dye in the ancient world, extracted from the murex mollusk, transformed common fabrics into luxury articles reserved for the elite. Lydia, the seller of purple cloth mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, traded a product whose value per kilogram could surpass that of gold. It is estimated that about 12,000 mollusks were needed to produce just 1.5 grams of purple dye. The purple robe that Roman soldiers placed on Jesus during the mockery before the crucifixion was no ordinary rag. It was a piece of considerable value, probably confiscated from some military depot. The banking system of the first century, although primitive compared to modern standards, was more developed than one might imagine. Besides the temple as a financial institution, there were trapezitai, private bankers who operated exchange tables and loans in the marketplaces. The parable of the talents in Matthew chapter 25 reflects this system with precision when the master rebukes the servant who buried the money, saying he should at least have deposited it with the bankers to earn interest. A talent was not a coin, but a unit of weight, approximately 34 kilograms of silver, equivalent to 6,000 denarii. This meant that a single talent represented more than 16 years of work for a common-day laborer. When Jesus tells a parable about a man who distributes 5, 2, and 1 talent, he is speaking of fortunes that most of his listeners would never see in their entire lives. Slavery was an integral part of the economy, although in Judea it took forms distinct from the classical Roman model. Jewish law provided for debt servitude. An indebted Israelite could sell himself as a servant for a maximum period of 6 years, after which he was to be freed in the sabbatical year. In practice, this did not always happen. The Greco-Roman world around it, however, ran massively on slave labor. It is estimated that between 20 and 30% of the population of the Roman Empire was composed of slaves. In cities like Corinth or Ephesus, the proportion could reach 40%. The empire's economy simply did not function without them. Slaves worked in agriculture, mining, construction, domestic service, education, and even in public administration. The cost of living in Jerusalem during the great festivals shot up dramatically. The city, which normally housed between 40 and 60,000 inhabitants, received between 200 and 300,000 pilgrims during Passover. Some historians, like Josephus, mention even larger numbers, reaching 2,500,000, although most modern academics consider those numbers exaggerated. Even so, the multiplication of the population by 4 or 5 times within a few days created an intense festival economy. Lodging, food, animals for sacrifice, water, fuel, everything became more expensive. Villagers from the towns around Jerusalem rented out rooms, sold provisions, and offered transport services to the pilgrims. The Last Supper of Jesus took place in a cenacle, an upper room borrowed or rented, precisely because finding space in Jerusalem during Passover was itself a negotiation. Agriculture followed a rigid calendar dictated by the seasons and the commandments of the Torah. The agricultural year began with the first rains of October and November, when the land was plowed and sown. Barley was harvested between March and April, wheat between May and June. Grapes, figs, and pomegranates ripened in summer. Olives were harvested in autumn. Each stage required intensive labor, and each harvest was immediately taxed. The Torah also prescribed that the corners of the fields not be harvested, so that the poor could glean. The Book of Ruth portrays this practice centuries earlier, but it remained in force in the time of Jesus. It was, in practice, the first documented social assistance program in history, embedded directly in the agricultural tax code. Salt deserves special mention. When Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth," the metaphor carried real economic weight. Salt was so valuable that it had been used as currency in various cultures. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, possibly linked to payments made in salt. In first-century Palestine, salt came primarily from the Dead Sea and was essential for preserving food in an age without refrigeration. Control of salt sources meant direct economic power. Herod held a monopoly over the extraction of salt and bitumen from the Dead Sea, and this revenue financed part of his megalomaniacal construction projects. What kind of economy is this, where the sweat of a man is worth 1 coin per day? But the exchange rate at the temple consumes a significant fraction of even that misery. The reality is that the gulf between rich and poor in first-century Palestine was as deep as any modern inequality. While the high priest Caiaphas lived in a mansion in the noble quarter of Jerusalem, archaeologists have found the remains of priestly houses with mosaic floors, frescoes on the walls, and private ritual baths. The day laborers of Lower Galilee lived in single-room stone houses, with wooden beam roofs covered with straw and mud. An entire family slept, cooked, and lived together in a space of 20 to 30 square meters. The family's animals frequently shared the same space during the night. It is in this scenario that the words of Jesus about wealth and poverty land with a force that is lost when read out of context. When he says it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, the audience listening knew exactly which wealthy people he was talking about. It was not a theological abstraction. It was a direct reference to the priestly aristocracy that accumulated land confiscated from debtors, to the Herodians who built palaces with slave labor, and to the temple merchants who profited from the devotion of others. When Jesus healed a leper and told him to present himself to the priest with the offering prescribed by Moses, he was not merely fulfilling a religious ritual. He was reintegrating that person into an economic system from which they had been completely excluded. Leprosy meant total isolation, no work, no commerce, no functioning family, no temple. The healing was not only physical, it was economic. And here another little explored dimension is revealed: the economy of women. In a patriarchal society like first-century Judea, women had extremely limited access to property and formal commerce. Widows without male children were in a particularly vulnerable situation, with no guaranteed inheritance, no income, dependent on community charity. When Jesus confronted the religious leaders saying they devoured the houses of widows, he was denouncing a documented practice: temple administrators who took advantage of the legal vulnerability of widows to confiscate properties in exchange for spiritual protection. It was economic exploitation disguised as piety. The coin of Judas, 30 pieces of silver, also reveals economic layers. 30 silver shekels were equivalent to approximately 120 denarii, or 4 months of work for a day laborer. It was also, according to the book of Exodus, the compensation price for a slave killed by an ox. The value carried a deliberate message. Jesus was valued at the price of a slave. Matthew records that Judas, seized with remorse, returned the coins to the priests, who refused to put them back in the temple treasury because it was blood money. With it, they bought the field of a potter to serve as a cemetery for foreigners. Even in death, money kept circulating, defining destinies. The miracles of multiplication of food take on another dimension when you calculate the cost. Philip, when Jesus asked him where they would buy bread to feed 5,000 men, not counting women and children, which could raise the total to 15 or 20,000 people, replied that 200 denarii would not be enough. 200 denarii represented nearly 7 months of work, and still it was not enough. The economy of scarcity was so brutal that even a relative fortune could not solve the most basic problem: feeding hungry people in a deserted place. Even Jesus' profession carries economic information. The Greek term tekton, used in the Gospels, is generally translated as carpenter, but in fact designates a construction artisan, someone who worked with wood, stone, and possibly metal. In first-century Galilee, wood was relatively scarce and expensive. Most buildings used stone. A tekton would be something between a carpenter and a stonemason, probably involved in the construction of roofs, doors, agricultural furniture such as plows and yokes, and stone structures. Nazareth was only 6 kilometers from Sepphoris, a large city that Herod Antipas was rebuilding as the capital of Galilee. It is plausible, though unproven, that Jesus and Joseph worked on the construction projects at Sepphoris. If they did, they earned 1 denarius a day, like any other day laborer. The economy of Jesus' time was at its core a system where the labor of many sustained the luxury of few, where institutionalized religion had merged with financial power, where taxes crushed the most vulnerable, and where land, the only survival resource for most people, became increasingly concentrated in the hands of those who already had too much. Every economy is, at its core, a system for measuring what matters. Rome measured power in conquered territories. The temple measured devotion in offered sacrifices. The market measured success in accumulated coins. What makes the economy of Jesus' time so fascinating to historians to this day is not only the numbers, the trade routes, or the taxation systems. It is the fact that within that system, a radical idea emerged that the value of a person could not be calculated in denarii. 2,000 years later, we are still trying to understand the price of things.